some reason it doesn't come past you, it's your responsibility to come up after the lecture and sign in. Otherwise, we have no way of hearing. I have some announcements before we move to today's lecture. First, John Steiner suggested that it would be valuable for me to clarify an answer to a question that I gave last week when we were looking at the segments of the Triumph of the Will. Someone asked whether the young Nazis that had just been shown raising their arms in the Hitler salute and jubilating, etc., whether any of them could have been Jews, and my answer was that if so, it couldn't have been more than a small handful. For various reasons. Well, what Dr. Steiner thought that I should emphasize, and I agree with him, is that from an organizational standpoint, it would have been impossible for any Jews to have been members of the Nazi organizations because their so-called racial or religious history was very carefully looked into before they were allowed to join those organizations. The only way that they could have been members would have been if they had falsified documents. And it's possible, of course, that at that relatively early time in the Third Reich that some of them did. Some misguided young Jews had documents falsified so that they could participate in this Nazi game. But as I said last week, it's extremely unlikely and for all practical purposes impossible. Now, of course, in the masses of people who were there just viewing the rally, there's a fair chance that some of those people were Jews. But he just wanted me to clarify that, and I hope I have. I intend this semester, before each lecture, to read a short reference to a Holocaust event that took place 50 years ago. This list of references was given to me generously by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust. And today, February 8th, on 1945, let me read you what happened. 1945, February 8th, actually it's tomorrow, but this is as close as we could come to today. 1945, during the night, 180 deportees from the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany, among Jews, are shot on the way from the Mauthausen train station to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Upper Austria because they cannot walk any farther in the deep snow. This was when people were being moved from various concentration camps, in this case Buchenwald, to concentration camps that were farther away from the advancing Western or Eastern Front. A couple of mundane announcements. Subscription forms for the Christian Science Monitor are up here in front. If you missed the chance to sign up for it, I again urge you to do so. And also copies of John Steiner's Reflections on Experiences in Nazi Death Camps are here for those of you who haven't yet been able to purchase a copy. They are $7 a piece. Come up afterwards and get them. Next, a library exhibit on the build-up to the Holocaust in Germany and the event itself, the Holocaust itself, is now being prepared over in the Ruben Salazar Library in the display areas on the first and second floors. It will be finished by next week, and I heartily invite you to check it out. A couple of times I've referred to the showings in the Sonoma Film Institute of the films The Triumph of the Will, the whole film, and The Wonderful Horrible Life of Leni Riefenstahl. Here are those showings. The Leni Riefenstahl biography will be shown on Friday the 3rd and Saturday the 4th of March at 7 o'clock. 3rd of March and 4th of March, Friday and Saturday. And The Triumph of the Will a week thereafter on Friday the 10th and Saturday the 11th, starting at 7 o'clock. A reminder about week after next, the discussion section meeting on Tuesday rather than on Thursday, and the lecture will be happening in this room on Thursday, the 23rd, rather than on Tuesday. That is Mary Feldsteiner's lecture, the second in our history series, of which the first is happening today. Next week's event will be a panel of survivors, our own Paul Benko, and Lucille Eichengreen, who lives currently in Berkeley, and Betty Kale from Santa Rosa. And this event is one of the most moving, if not the most moving in the whole series, as you get to people who were there, who have terrible experiences and often inspiring ways of dealing with those experiences to relate. So I hope you won't miss next week's event. This week, we are having a historical background lecture on tolerance and intolerance in Western society. The speakers are Peter Mellini and Steve Watrous, both from Sonoma State History Department. Peter is currently the chair of the History Department. Professor Watrous's undergraduate work was done at the University of Wisconsin, and he got his master's degree there as well, and he got his PhD at the University of Washington. Peter John Dreyfus Mellini shares with me the dubious distinction of being so enamored of one university that we got all of our degrees there, and in both of our cases that university was Stanford. Professor has been here at Sonoma State since 1968, and Professor Mellini since 1970. Please welcome them to the series.
The topic, obviously, is the question of toleration and intoleration, or intolerance in Western society. And the issue that raised itself for me was, to what degree was Western society more intolerant of minorities, other groups, than any other society out there, as in terms of looking at a backdrop for the 19th and 20th century emergence of a new type of anti-Semitism in many manifestations. And as it turns out, I want to spend some time on the more traditional elements of intolerance, and for that matter, tolerance in Western civilization. But I want to zero in really on what happens in Germany from the Enlightenment and the emancipation of European Jews, or at least some Jews in Europe, just before the French Revolution, and the impact of the Napoleonic emancipation of society in general, and the reaction against that occurs especially in Germany, a kind of romantic reaction. And if you look at your yellow sheets there, I listed some of the generators, so to speak, of both tolerance and intolerance: state, church, or state, religion, and society. In other words, from above on the part of state and church, or at least organized religion, society, and society from down below. But what's new, as we look at our historical survey, is that when we reach the 19th century, we begin to find intellectuals and ideologists getting involved in a justification of intolerance. And in this sense, we can explore some of the seeds of National Socialism before there's ever any Adolf Hitler or any National Socialist Party that emerged after World War II. And in this case, I think it's rather interesting because we can see some of the specific seeds of intolerance in a kind of romantic, so-called folkish thought in 19th century Germany as a reaction to some of the toleration edicts and legislation that occurred at the turn of the century, around 1800 or so. So what I wanted to do, first of all, is take a look at some other civilizations, just in terms of getting an idea of how tolerant or intolerant Western civilization has been in contrast to other civilizations out there. And I'm not sure that I at least came up with any specific conclusions other than most societies have had their spells of legislated intolerance or institutionalized intolerance off and on. And most of these other societies have been, in fact, more complex than traditional Western civilization, which has tended to, since the fall of the Roman Empire at least, see a kind of split between, at least of monotheists in Western civilization, between a vast Christian majority, to the degree that it became Christianized, and a rather small Jewish minority, with very few exceptions in a kind of religious ideological sense until we get to the Reformation. So in this sense, look at, for instance, just very briefly, Hindu society. You may find that this is a rather cursory and glib overview, but I just want to at least get some thought perking in our minds. If we look at Hindu society, for instance, by and large, what there is of intoleration tends to get segregated into castes. So the various castes and subcastes barely coexist with each other. They have their own duties, their own social lives, very pluralistic discrimination, in that the various groups castes are not doing much interaction amongst themselves. So if there are any new groups or new types of faith, they tend to get submerged into this common, very kaleidoscopic whole. In the ancient Middle East, by contrast, we can see such societies as the Assyrians, for that matter, that just about decimate all of their neighbors, including ancient Hebrews or Israel, to be followed up, of course, by the Babylonians or the Chaldeans, which, according to popular accounts, scattered the 10 lost tribes. Well, actually, it was the Assyrians scattered the 10 lost tribes, and the Babylonians finish off, so to speak, carrying off or deporting to Babylon the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah, which may be somewhat nicer, quote unquote, but it's certainly a form of persecution. The Romans followed suit. If we look at their relationships with Jews in terms of a number of Jewish revolts, attempting to maintain their customs and their religious ways and so forth, and in this respect the Romans weren't especially notable for their toleration of those that denied the divinity of the emperor as time went on, or specific customs one way or another that didn't meld into the Roman Empire. If we look at Islam as a follow-up, we might find, yes, Islam definitely tolerates peoples of the book, monotheists that in some way or other contributed to the preliminaries of Islam, especially Jews and Christians. The so-called dhimmi, the tolerated minorities as they became, certainly were tolerated, but there were forms of discrimination in terms of taxation policies, dress, synagogue and church building and things like that. So even has built in legislatively from the very beginning, from the Quran, elements of toleration, at least for monotheists. We won't mention polytheists, they didn't fare so well. Islam has had a pretty good track record, and certainly many of us are aware of the relative tolerance in medieval Spain of the Islamic emirs of Spain, which set probably a better example of toleration in Islam than in places such as Iraq or elsewhere. For instance, Charlemagne's good friend, long-distance friend, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, decreed a special dress for all Christians and Jews. Not real persecution, but certainly not very much live and let live. If we go farther to the Far East, to East Asia, we can find examples of, more recently, of toleration in general, live and let live, but also legislative intolerance in terms of banning or Christians and also tolerating them legislatively. So we can see a number of different aspects in this respect, and I included the USSR last on the list because here we have an example of class intolerance, the idea of liquidating those of different classes, not necessarily races or ethnic groups or religions. So we can, coming back to Western civilization, we can ask this question: to what degree did Western civilization have a kind of off and on policy towards its most visible monotheist minority, the Jewish population? Please.
Yeah, I just might add, the Japanese in particular have had have acquired and maintain a notion of their racial uniqueness, which is based simply on a belief, and the result is that anyone who is of Korean extraction, even to this day, who are racially and genetically no different from the Japanese, is discriminated against in all sorts of extraordinary ways right to this day.
Right. Well, at any rate, we can see in fact, if you look at some of the maps in the beginning section of Gilbert's book, The Holocaust, you get a rather graphic presentation before your very eyes in terms of what Jews in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period did by way of constructive achievements, and also the various types of persecutions and scattering of Jews one way or another. So we see a kind of off-again, on-again relationship in the West European civilization. And one thing that I am interested in looking at through my short public appearance today is the quest for some kind of integrated society. I'm not talking about integrated persons as such, but to what degree was social integration, religious integration, seen as necessary for the society as a whole, and this necessity, whatever the dynamics that motivated society or state or church, what did they expect from it by driving Jews out of city A, B, or C, or inviting them back again when they found they couldn't survive too well without their know-how or their capital or whatever it might be. So we've got this interesting situation of Western society, which was certainly not as complex as Hindu society or Middle Eastern society or Islamic society, with, in a sense, pretty much one rather well-defined other, Jews, who themselves weren't, how should we say, all that anxious to become fully integrated into Western Christian society as well. So we've got, in effect, historically, two relatively exclusivist groups coming from the same Judeo-Christian ideological strain that both had visions, you might say, of their special characteristics. Obviously, Jews were in no position to begin to convert all of Western Christian society, but on occasion, Western Christians felt the necessity, the compulsion to do this kind of thing. The result, of course, was a kind of scattering of Jews since the Roman scattering in the early AD times that brought many Jews to Western Europe. Gilbert has a nice map there that tells us how long we find evidence of Jews in Italy and France and some of the other parts of the latter Roman Empire. But generally speaking, because Jews were seen as a permitted religion, religio licita, they were generally speaking licit and allowed, but in an urban context. Jews could never be like the rest of society in terms of owning land, at least very, very rarely owning land. In a sense, they were perforce forced to live in a society that was not urban, and in many ways take up their residences in ghetto-like surroundings. The word ghetto comes from the Italian, roughly Renaissance time, for the word a little city, a borghetto, if you will. That's just the word we use. There are obviously other European words for ghetto. But we also find not only their urban character and their relatively more educated character in terms of keeping up for the mainstream, urban or rural, society or state, or whatever the manifestations of church might be. So we can see, for instance, when in the higher Middle Ages, crusades took hold of the Western religious imagination, or the Western political imagination, or warfaring imagination, that at least as long as they were to be, in the long run, directed against Islam and for the liberation of Jerusalem, or of whatever, Byzantium, or you name it, Jews oftentimes were caught in the way as the zealous crusaders from top to bottom decided to have a round of preliminary bashing on their route, whether they were in the Rhineland or even in Italy, on their route to the Middle East. And so, interestingly, we can find for the first time during the Crusades that the Western crusading zeal against some alien other wasn't just against Jews en route or Byzantines in Byzantium or Muslims in the Holy Land, but also against, for the first time, heretics, perceived heretics in the midst of Western Christian civilization. And in the 1200s, we see an interesting example of basically a root out and destroy campaign coordinated by both church and state, papacy, Inquisition, and the kings of France against the so-called Albigensian heretics in the south of France that had a fair amount of feudal noble support behind them, hence being a real force. So here for the first time we see some kind of another group that takes it on the nose, relatively speaking, and it would suggest that this relatively monolithic West European fabric, at least in terms of its religious ideals, in other ways it was very deeply rent and split, at least could go out after any that it perceived as a threat one way or another to Western Christianity. Obviously this became more important at the time of the Protestant Reformation, when we find all kinds of Protestant groups in Germany especially being forced to leave one part of Germany for another, or from Germany to Bohemia, or Jews, in fact, being invited in by kings of, mainly by rulers. In fact, mainly it was the heads of state in the German lands or to the east that invited Jews and persecuted Protestants one way or another. But we also see in Spain at the time of the Inquisition, basically a state-inspired organization but carried out by high religious clerics such as Torquemada. We find the basic problem of the converted Jew, the converso, coming out more highlighted than it before this time. Certainly there was the issue of, well, what if Jews become baptized and become converted? Will life be safe for them or not? And Gilbert in his maps has got some instances of the precariousness of this situation. But with the idea of making Spain into a state of a single faith, that Moors and Jews either need to eventually leave or else convert and to become good Christians at all times and in all places, dual faith believers. We've got the suspicion on the part of at least many Spaniards that Jews were not sincere in their conversion. So we've got, beginning really with the Inquisition, this problem of, well, what if Jews do comply and they go through the trappings, or maybe more than that, maybe a heartfelt religious conversion? Would the Christian majority accept them as is, as bona fide members of newly integrated society, quote unquote, or would they still be seen as some kind of other and insincere and suspect? And this is a kind of a problem that would haunt Western Christian civilization, and for that matter, Western secular civilization, once we get past the French Revolution, all the way up into our 20th century. I mention on my little outline here the Westphalia for just a couple of reasons. You've got the date on there, and this was a treaty that, first of all, following our theme of tolerance, gave a kind of grudging tolerance, or at least it gave a nod to the idea that Germany could be both Protestant and Catholic. We don't have much to say about Jews here, but the idea that somehow an all-European, a pan-European peace allowed Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire, still extant, this is the First Reich, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire, to exercise their Protestantism according to the will of the ruler of the specific state. And in this respect, there's only a kind of halfway toleration, because within a specific German state, there is only one official religion, at least generally speaking. So if you didn't like it, if you didn't love it, so to speak. So in this case, we really don't have a full tolerance within all the various German lands, multiple hundreds, maybe thousands of little German states. So this was a kind of a halfway house, in a way. Cuius regio eos religio. Whoever lives in a region, that determines his or her religion. And so we're moving in a way toward a greater tolerance, but although split into these many, many different both religious and political units. And so the Treaty of Westphalia was seen as a kind of a rock bottom, a nadir, so to speak, in the march toward a more unified German state, something that, of course, France and England and now Holland, not to mention Spain, all had. And very few people in Germany regretted this. In the 1700s, we find, generally speaking, a population within Central and Western Europe of about 400,000 Jews. This excludes Poland, Hungary, Russia, and so forth. And about 300,000 of this number, about 75%, live in the German lands. A relatively small number live in France. Very, very few in Spain. Obviously, they've been and almost totally, in fact, deported. Many of them went north to France and Holland and England. Others went to the Ottoman Empire, where the Ottomans, the Islamic Ottomans, provided a very tolerant service in welcoming these Spanish or Sephardic Jews to the Ottoman Empire, where they still live relatively happily in Turkey. And we might say that the dispersion of the Sephardic Jews from Spain, 15 and 16, 1500s, and then their life along the fringe of Western Europe, England, Holland, France, and so forth, tended to be, how should we say, a more integrated life, tended to, than the life of you might say, their counterpart Jews, the Ashkenazi German Jews, Germanic Jews that lived in the Germanic lands and to the east. And the ones, the Sephardic Jews, relatively small in number, to be allowed to integrate more in the relatively liberal societies of England and Holland especially. Spinoza, for instance, was a Sephardic Portuguese Jew there, although he had his ups and downs within his own community, needless to say. We've got Dutch Jews that fare fairly well. So in some ways, in fact, if we use the idea of Hans Kohn, that the Western Jews always had it bad, in a minimal way, or with someone like Benjamin Disraeli as Prime Minister in England. Maybe not the best example, but we're looking at a situation that generally was more liberal on the western fringe of Europe than in the center, or especially in the Far East, or the Eastern Europe, where Jews tended to be forced to be exclusive, and by their own willingness tended to live a life apart from Gentile. Now, there were some individuals, enlightened individuals, so to speak, in Germany, both Jewish and Gentile, that sought to change this situation. And perhaps our first one on the list is Gottfried, I believe, Lessing, a German poet in the mid and later playwright, mid and later 1700s, who was concerned about the problem of Jewish ghetto life. And some of his writings talked about the basic idea that ultimately all faiths, at least all monotheistic faiths, sought the same God. This was his famous play that created a certain sensation in Germany, Nathan the Wise, took place in a medieval setting. Or another of his works was called The Jews. This came out in 1749, where a Jewish traveler befriends a Gentile baron, obviously, and the baron is very taken with this Jewish traveler who dresses like just any European nobleman and begins to entertain thoughts of marriage to his daughter who's with him. And the traveler steps in and says, "Well, I'm a Jew," implying you better not think too much more. And the baron and the daughter herself asks, "Well, what difference does that make?" At which point the daughter's kind of lady in waiting says, "It makes a big difference, and I'll fill you in on all the details." Lessing's morale was that in higher society, enlightened society, the details might not stand for much, that all men and women are equal, ultimately, as Thomas Jefferson created equal, as Jefferson put it, but down below there were still a lot of biases and cultural preconceptions and so forth. Another writer let's go to Moses Mendelssohn, though he's third on your sheet here. Moses Mendelssohn was a good friend of Lessing, and Mendelssohn's idea was that Jews ought to seek to break loose of the cramping life of the ghetto. And one of his big tasks was to translate the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, into German for the first time, a task which he completed, and saw this as a stepping stone to bring Jews into reading for the likes of Adolf Hitler, which banned Mendelssohn's music, regardless of the amount of assimilation and the heartfelt conversion, if you will, that the grandson and daughter of Moses Mendelssohn felt. But the point here was that Mendelssohn and Lessing and Christoph Daum, another thinker, who felt that merely by legislative act, the princes would legislate emancipation of the Jews from their cramping life and allow them to become full citizens, that there would be no problem. It was just a matter of rational thinking and rational legislation. And in fact, we might say Daum was right on target in the immediate sense, because we do find someone like the emperor of the Habsburg emperor of the Austrian Empire, to put it bluntly, Joseph II, who in the 1780s emancipated the Jews in his empire. In effect, they were to receive full civil rights. There was no parliament, of course, that they could vote for and so forth, but at least they were equal before the law, and they had certain privileges along with everybody else. And this was the vision of some of the Enlightenment emancipators, that if we get the nobility and the Protestants and other sects and all on the same keel, then somehow we can have basically equal citizenship, and as Gordon Craig puts it, the common citizenship of all the members of society will lead to a harmonious whole. Now, if this isn't social and political and civil integration, then I don't know what it is. But it had to be tried. And Joseph II, beating the French Revolution by about a decade, was the first to attempt this type of action. This meant that Jews could wear swords in downtown Vienna if they chose, something that some people didn't like, especially all of a sudden, that they could attend the universities now. Relatively radical new departures that didn't always sit too well, but we've got the French Revolution coming up, and in this respect, this would change a lot of things very fast and very, very rapidly. The French Revolution, needless to say, passed its own coming along, and the Jewish community as a whole having to regularize its relationship with the mainstream. And I just wanted to give you a quote from the renunciation by the Sanhedrin of Paris of their separate status. This was something the Jews themselves in France voted on and agreed to disband. And Abraham Furtado, a Sephardic Jew, said, "We are no longer a nation within a nation. France is our country." And I mention this because, in a sense, this one statement by a French Jew symbolizes the great hopes, the great expectations of the Enlightenment and the emancipation process that Napoleon helped to foster one way or another. So we have obviously not just civil rights and so forth, but also intermarriage that's legally permitted if the religious body, of course, itself would permit it. So in this respect, we've got the emancipation process begins, and in fact, with Napoleon's conquest of Germany, we have various emancipation and civil rights pieces of legislation being implemented in the German states, especially the German states along the Rhine and so forth. And at the same time, we see Napoleon abolishing the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, which nobody shed any tears about at first, but later on would be seen as an ignominious debacle for what once has stood proudly as the great German state that encompassed all of the Germanies. Okay. Now, in reaction to the Napoleonic conquest of Germany especially, was coming up from down below alongside, ultimately, when Napoleon began to retreat from Russia, alongside forces from above, Prussia, Austria, the battle of the nations, so to speak, we have German volunteer units that weren't necessarily motivated by their kings or their emperors or princes in Germany. Here, for the first time, we begin to see Germans and German thinkers shape for themselves a kind of vision of a new Germany that would stand in stark contrast to France and the ideals of the French Revolution. And in this respect, we begin to find the emergence of an alternative type of integration, not one necessarily that would tolerate other influences in the new Germany. And these other influences were first and foremost, at this point in time, 1815 and on, French influences. But they also came very quickly to include Jewish influences. And a lot of the emancipation legislation that Napoleon had enacted in Western Germany and the Rhine Confederation were toppled and overturned. We have a certain kind of turning the clock back intellectually on the part of these new thinkers, looking to inspiration from the Middle Ages, but also looking forward to a united German state, one where Germans could become Germans, and they would speak just German. They would, how shall we say, celebrate German songs, a purged German language. They would have German folk and national festival. They would have, you might say, institutions, popular institutions that would push themselves in a way of creating a climate of opinion for this new Germany. And the leader in this respect was a man named Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, oftentimes called just Father Jahn. And I introduce Father Jahn to you as a kind of leader type, one who saw himself as a kind of prototypical leader to a kind of regeneration, a rebirth of a new Germany, and one that would ultimately be a united Germany, but one that would not have, let's put it this way, would not really tolerate Jews or foreign influences. Father Jahn, for one thing, sought to organize young Germans. And in keeping with the film that we saw last week, some of the various promote the exercise and the physical well-being of young Germans, and promote it not in a competitive spirit in the sense of, well, having playoffs and being sent to the national, you might say, tournament or trials, but competitive in a martial, military type of spirit to prepare and steel Germans for the upcoming war that would come about. Some kind of an enemy, presumably against from the outside, but there were also others that, as we said, Jews and Poles too. As he put it, a state without a people, without a folk, is nothing, such as Austria, which had all kinds of peoples in Austria, unlike what would be the new Germany. And a people without a state is nothing. Stateless peoples like Gypsies and Jews, and I might add at this time Poles as well. So basically Father Jahn wanted a state based on the folk, on the people, and on a study of the people and their customs and so forth. This is a brand new type of state where the popular masses are still relatively untouched by civilization, by the Enlightenment and so forth. And in this respect, the festive dress, the costumes, the folk songs, the folk festivals and so forth, all of this needed to be studied. And in a sense, we have a great push toward called Deutschheit, Germanity, so to speak, Germanic studies, if you will. And in this respect, we have a first type of, you might say, scholarly activity in trying to figure out, you might say, the heartbeat of the nation, something that had never really happened before the French Revolution. Deutsches Volkstum was what this was called. So we can have a German rebirth through and this kind of Blut und Boden, getting back to the soil and the blood of the people. That type of idea was developed by Father Jahn and some of his allies, so to speak. Well, I've got to start winding this up a little bit. We need to have a kind of trial case, a test case. How far could a Jew become a German and excel at being a German in some ways, and yet still be rejected as a German? Heinrich Heine presents himself as really par excellence the German poet of the early 19th century, a kind of true heir to Goethe, who died in 1832. Heine has another 30-some years, well, 25 years left to go as a poet, one way or another. And Heine grew up in his early days. He attended, in fact, joined a Germanic fraternity. He wasn't booted out of the fraternity for being a Jew, interestingly enough, but we're told for lack of chastity. Not that he didn't drink and duel, but I guess he had too much of an eye for the ladies in the university town of Bonn, which he attended. But Heinrich Heine was always rubbing people, not always, but oftentimes rubbing people the wrong way, German people, in the sense that even though he wrote exquisite German poetry and he excelled as a kind of a folk poet, one who studied the folk on Heinrich Heine, in that he really was not serious enough to be a German. I'm not sure how indicative this is, but when I went to Germany years and years ago, and we were told about the epigones, those that followed Goethe and Schiller as the great poets, or the not so great poets, I should say. We never had included for us Heinrich Heine. He was just somebody else. We had poets much younger than, or much less known than that we had to study. And so there's, even in my time, and back there in Germany in around 1960 or so, there was a kind of gap, a kind of chasm in the official canon of who was respectable in German literature.
Yeah,
and go ahead, Peter.
I might point out, as Gordon Craig does, that Heine was a native of Dusseldorf, and there were moves in the 50s and 60s to rename the university for him, and they all, and it seems to be associated with this reaction against Heine's irreverent position and the fact that he wasn't perceived, even in Dusseldorf and the university, as a good enough German.
Well, here we have the problem of assimilation. Now, Heine did not convert to Christianity, but he certainly went the extra mile in many, 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 many ways in terms of becoming a good German. Certainly his knowledge and his was not in favor of a republic such as France had. And so this critique runs, this is by one Eduard Meyer, obviously not Jewish, says of Heine, "Baptized or not, it's all the same. We don't hate the religion of these Asiatics, but rather the many hateful characteristics of these Asiatics. Their so frequent impudence and presumption, their immorality and frivolity, their noisy behavior, and their so frequently approach to life. They belong to no people, no state, no community. They rove about the world as adventurers, sniffing about, and they stay where they find lots of opportunity for speculation. Where things go quietly and in accordance with the law, there they find it. Oh, where things go quietly and in accordance with the law, there they find it uncomfortable." So here, interestingly, we find, in a sense, the beginning of this idea of the Jew as a rootless cosmo, truly congenial to German minds. Of all our lyric poets, he was the only one who never wrote a drinking song. For shame. This Oriental was unable to carouse the German way. Now, maybe I couldn't carouse quite the German way, but here's somebody born and bred in Germany. And if this is all that Treitschke has against Heine, then, well, but it was enough. And here's this perceived as not behaving the right way, then we have a failure, a perceived failure of the emancipation. Then what? What do we do with this presumed failure of emancipation for Jews that wouldn't behave the right way, such as Heine? And we begin to find in the popular literature, such as the famous novel read by everybody, at the time, Gustav Freytag, in the mid-19th century, it was called Debt and Credit, Soll und Haben, and it's about Vital Itzig, typical Jewish name, who was a kind of Germanic robber baron. This is the age when industrialization begins to take off, when you have increasing urbanization, the movement toward, ultimately, the unification of Germany under Prussian auspices and not under Romantic auspices at all. So we've got this question of why can some Jews seem to adopt or adapt as well as they can to the new industrialization and make money at it, perhaps. This raised some of the questions of the fact that Jews could never really fully assimilate, that they had these alien values within them. And at the same time, among some Germans, they saw along the eastern frontier the ghettos of the Austrian Empire, of the Russian Empire, and so forth. These were the only two empires east of Germany at the time, and a kind of mystique of the ghetto. Strange Jews in their kaftans scurrying about that wasn't as visibly typical as what they saw in Germany at all, but yet was still there, and the connections were drawn, that there must be some kind of connection. In fact, one of the connections drawn with the success of some Jews in the new industry was they're plotting to take over the world. This is the beginning of this idea of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Somehow Jewish leaders were, through capitalism and through financial speculation, going to get a stranglehold on the world as a whole. Last and certainly not least, we have Eugen Dühring, a philosopher at the University of Berlin and a bitter enemy of Karl Marx, the ex-Jew, if we will, who saw many Jews as typically capitalist. Basically, Dühring says that wrote that in his book, The Jewish Question, 1880, basically said that all the assimilation and all the conversion wouldn't work, that Christianity wasn't enough to really convert the Jews, that these alien characteristics were so deep-seated that there was only one you might say, stop left to pull out for Germans to be able to combat this kind of infiltration, this insidious penetration of German culture, and that was to bring the Nordics back and bring them to the rescue. Christianity had failed as Düring put it, and for that matter, Nietzsche as well. And at this point, rather dramatic alternatives and, you might say, our urgent methods had to be resorted to. At this point, too, I'll leave and let Peter take over. Thanks.
It's always a joy to work with my colleague, Steve Watrous. I'm having the unique experience of team teaching with him, and he is full of surprises and all. I wanted to begin with a sort of personal note because it underlines the theme that I think is very important for us to grasp. The era 1850 through 1950 was an era in Europe and North America that was rampant with discrimination. I grew up in Los Angeles. In fact, in the midst of the largest group and one of the most activist groups of the largest part of American Jewish community. My mother was descended from a German family from the Rheinland-Pfalz, as far as I could tell. One of my middle names is Dreyfus, and my mother never sort of came to terms with the fact that this made her technically a Jew. And she had plenty of Jewish friends, and in fact taught in the famous Jewish high school of those days, and in herself wasn't prejudiced, but carried all the sort of Jewish, anti-Jewish feelings that were sort of endemic in middle class America at the time. How endemic were they? Well, one Stanford story that Phil may know, there were quotas. I'm not quite sure when they quite ended for students, but there were certainly quotas among the faculty. And one of the Los Angeles, that Mark Mankel, who was one of the first history faculty to be hired, told me that he went to Hollywood High School, and he said that in Los Angeles, that the word was that the first Jewish president of Stanford University would be an Episcopalian, and in fact he was. He converted Episcopalian, one of the man who was head of the medical school, who replaced Lyman. Yeah, he was anti-Semitism, which I'm unhappy to tell you is in fact a late 19th century euphemism for the hatred of Jews, in the German Judenhass, was simply a fact of life, as was a whole raft of other discrimination against Asians, discrimination against blacks, and even discrimination against Catholics or Protestants, depending on the area, particularly in the East, not so much in Los Angeles, but that's a whole other story. Now, quickly, let me run over some roots of traditional European anti-Semitism. There are really three main components. One is what's called the deicide accusation, i.e. the Jews responsible for Christ's death, that great crime against faith in God. It's worthwhile reporting that the Catholic Church, as well as the Protestant denominations, have repudiated this interpretation solidly for quite a while. The second is more subtle, is that the Christian supersession myth, that particularly Western Christianity, meaning Roman Catholicism, papacy which represented it, came to believe in the Middle Ages that Christianity had superseded Judaism as well as any other faith that claimed to be monotheistic, and they were the people of the covenant, and that Christians thus denied the legitimacy of Islam, of Judaism. But I have to point out, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention, is that if anti-Semitism is applicable, there is a particularly virulent kind of anti-Semitism still in existence, directed against varieties of Muslims, as Steve pointed out in the Crusades. The third element of traditional European Christian anti-Semitism, besides deicide, the supersession myth. The third element is the supposed moral turpitude. Jews were thought or claimed to have demonic powers, and in times of calamity they were victims of mob violence. So in the Middle Ages, for Western European Christian, Jews were to be dispersed and kept out of Christian society, hence the ghettos. They were encouraged to convert voluntarily, but were to be isolated and humiliated. And the caricatures of Jews in the Middle East portrayed them as satanic, as devils, as demonic figures, and clearly not human. And one of the ironies here is the church actually intervened sometimes to protect them. But they continue to do that even in the modern era. Now, the elements of modern anti-Semitism, which dates, as Steve has pointed out, really from the last quarter of the 19th century, but sets in earlier, clearly Heine's experience and others are relevant, are this. One, class antagonism. And one of the ironies of this whole thing is that discredited religious faith known as Marxism, or even neo-Marxism, still argue that class antagonism was an essential fact of modern history. Well, it is part of it, but most modern, certainly historians, take up a much more, out of all scale, the role of Jewish traders, bankers, and industrialists in the coming of the modern industrial state. What these various figures said was something like this. They argued that with the defeat of capitalism, not only would utopia come, but Judaism and even Christianity would vanish. And later in the century, when anti-Semitism emerged in its modern form, and Jewish hatred part of the right-wing ideas, then revisionist Marxists and revisionist socialists repudiated this particular point of view. The second element, besides the class antagonisms, which certainly added to the framework, was social Darwinism. We forget that as early as 1850, Herbert Spencer, who actually coined the term, life was a constant human struggle. And after Darwin published The Origin of the Species and talked about the survival of the fittest and all, the notions, Darwin's notions, were applied to nations and to races, rather loosely defined, and according to the social Darwinists, the future belonged to the nations, and it belonged to the strongest right to rule, not the fittest, but the strongest. And these were certainly the notions of social Darwinism were pervasive by the end of the century. Another element that Steve has alluded to is the theory of racial differences. The 19th century is the font, really, in the beginning of the modern study of humanity, those we now refer to as anthropology and sociology and all. And it was badly perverted in the early days by its uses and by the way it was expanded and all. As early as 1840, a German linguist, one of the sort of most important fields that expand knowledge of the origins of language the most important work was done by Germans in particular, and a German linguist named Christian Lassen argued that Semites, in quotes, who spoke a variety of tongues were egotistically exclusive, but Indo-Europeans whose languages had a common origin were tolerant and altruistic. Now, there is no notion of blood or race in here. This is a notion of language as later on, not much later, right around 1850, Count Gobineau, in his influential tract, The Inequality of the Human Races, published in 1854, called the Aryan race. He said they were tall, blonde, blue-eyed, a superior culture-bearing people. All of this complex of ideas are were widely accepted. The 19th century was just replicit all over Europe and in North America with theories of race and of associated qualities and all. You had such, for instance, pseudoscience notions as phrenology, in which you would determine the actual intelligence and all by the shape of the skull. And you had one of the most extraordinary and bizarre collections of skulls and other physical, other parts of the skeleton, I think at Göttingen, which one of the great centers of German learning, that is still there, that were collected in order to verify these notions of race and their associations with superiority. I might point out that that just recently it turned out that the Smithsonian agreed to destroy the photographs of some of the best and the brightest at Yale and Wellesley. And Phil, I'm trying to remember, did we have to submit to nude photographs at Stanford too? I don't remember that. No, and we were there about and notice that in fact the reason for collecting these was based on some notion. There was some study of posture going on, but basically a now discredited notion. This is in the 1950s and 60s, drawn up through apparently people like George Bush earlier after the war, and even Hillary and Bill, and even an ex-wife of mine. I now think about it, that makes me very. Though I didn't need to see a photograph there. Anyway. I'm happy to say. But notice here is a racial, in 19th century terms, a racially based notion of cultural traits. Now those are the well, and there's more. Steve has very carefully sketched in the German popular and high cultural rejection of the Enlightenment notions of emancipation and popular sovereignty and toleration and all. And in fact, I don't really need to say any more about it, but I just want to underline the idea of being German became intimately associated not only with the language, but with Christianity. Now, one of the ironies to this day is that, as far as I know, the German state that exists now, the heir of all of this tradition, is the only one that still believes in this sort of blood notion of civilization. If you have a relative, as far as I know, if you have a relative going back to the Middle Ages, literally, that you can document as German, you can claim Germans. I can claim it becomes Feldwebel Scheck, apparently. And you can just go to the German consul and say, I want a passport. And in fact, one of the things that apparently is really annoying the West Germans, the Wessis, at the moment, is not so much the Aussies who have now sort of settled down a bit, but the number of Ostdeutsche, I guess you could call them, who have been living in Russia and the Balkans for about 200 or 300 years, They've retained their German last names. Their connection to German culture is probably pretty tenuous. They are now coming back and claiming German citizenship and a place at the head of the queue for jobs and everything else. And I can still remember an extremely pissed off friend of my wife, who is both grew up in Cologne, who was complaining about one of these Ostdeutsche who has come into her clinic where she works and is demanding all these privileges. But she's playing German. So these notions of citizenship and race and all still exist, notions of blood, to this day. It also became married with Christianity. Steve made that point. Could be Catholic or Protestant, but it was better probably to be Protestant, but still. The other thing was the eternal outsider. Steve has pointed out, the assimilated Jew was seen as really unassimilable. The Jew became, in a sense, the symbol of foreigners, of dark, evil forces, forever polluting the purity of the German people. And this was also attached to groups with far less capacity to defend themselves, in particular the gypsies, who were wiped out in Germany. The fourth element after the racial and all was the cult of state power. Not only did the German intellectuals and people reject the ideas of the Enlightenment and the notions of social contract, popular sovereignty, and even the rule of law, they postulated a state that was a necessity individual citizen, and in fact the embodiment of the individual citizen. Fichte, in his address to the German nation at the time of the Napoleonic invasions and the takeover and the disbursement, postulated a state that was a necessity for the individual citizen who realized himself in the service of the state. And then that, I'm trying to be polite, thinker running through all this, you have to realize that from 1850, but particularly from 1875 on, the transformation, the modernization of Germany was going forward at an extraordinary rate. A population explosion accompanied by urbanization, the life of not only the Germans, but most Western Europeans. In 1800, there were 1.5 million Jews in Europe, 2.5 million in the world. By 1850, there were 4.1 million Jews in Europe and 4.7 in the world. By 1860, there were 5 million Jews in Europe. Now, the majority of those Jews lived in the Pale of the Settlement, in the East, in Stetl and whatever, Stetlach, more accurately, in Russia or in what was now part of Poland. They were, by the end of the century, increasingly poor and suffering from increased political persecution. Hundreds of thousands of those Jews immigrated. Most of them, in fact, came to the United States and to North America. Those who remained in Eastern Europe turned inward, often to Hasidic Jewry, or were the original part of the first wave of immigrants to Palestine, to Israel, and turned to Zionism when it emerged in the last decade of the 19th century. Jews in Western Europe, however, appeared to have the option of full citizenship. But as Steve has made clear, they were denied this. And then, after 1873, the situation began to change significantly. But I want to stress that even though we'll talk most of the time about Germany, we're talking about a European-wide situation. Steve has put it very neatly, and I don't want to go into the dilemmas, the Highness dilemma and the rest of the assimilated, the attempts at assimilation. But in 1873, the Berlin stock market crashed. And Gordon Craig, probably the leading American historian of modern Germany, writes, "It's not too much to say that anti-Semitism in its modern, virulent form had its origins in the Berlin stock market crash of 1873. After the crash, a sort of avalanche of books, pamphlets, lectures, and even the theater plays appeared in both the, you might say, high media and middle media and low media that were increasingly anti-Semitic and intolerant. Writers such as Dühring, Paul de Lagarde, Wilmar attacked the Jews as an alien element in German society, as carriers of a disease that contaminated its vital forces and threatened it with degeneracy and death. And these fantasies began to take on even big terms, and they were couched in pseudoscientific language with random quotations from anthropologists, biologists, psychologists, and theologians that impressed the gullible and confirmed or gave form to prejudice that clearly, as Steve has made clear, already existed, the lesson play and all that sort of thing. The more rabid forms of anti-Semitism got even more stimulus from people like Treitschke, who was the leading historian of German Empire, by the court preacher, the leading Protestant court preacher in Alfred Stocke, and by Wagner, who, for reasons that I'm not exactly clear on, simply hated Jews. And in their work, also in many widely read novels, the Jews were portrayed the Christians were portrayed as the hero, honorable, idealistic, dedicated to the service of others. Jewish antagonists as self-centered, cowardly, materialistic, and unscrupulous. And the coining of the actual term was apparently developed by a racialist ideologue named Wilhelm Marr in either 1878 or 1879. The date from the material I had wasn't clear. In a way to legitimize what had been called in German Judenhass. And that was too cruel. That was too specific. And so what he did was a term that was scientific and hygienic, anti-Semitism. Now, there was a bit of a problem with this that came up during the Second World War. The Nazis formed an alliance with the then Palestinian leadership, and the leader of the Palestinians was a man named Hajj al-Amin al-Husseini, who was clearly a Semite. He fled the British, he fled from Palestine and fled to Berlin, where he took refuge, and so the Germans had to make him an honorary Arab in order to get around the problem that they'd equated. Out of the satanic libel, remember we talked about the notion of the pact with the devil. Late in the 19th century, a whole series of tales began to emerge, and eventually they were codified under the sponsorship of the chief of the Tsarist secret police. Radetzky was his name, I think. Okay. They were published in 1903 and 1905 in Paris, first of all, and then published worldwide, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which promulgated a notion of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy designed to run the world. Have been discredited time and time again, although they were published in America, certainly in the Nazi period, published widely. I'm sorry to point out that Henry Ford believed them and published them. And they were even recently published in, of all places, Japan. And in fact, a major Japanese publisher had to apologize for publishing these just this last week, publishing these libels, and his magazine out of business, only apparently after making quite a bit of money. There seems to be a kind of incredible sort of Japanese have no contact with Jews that I know of, that's any specifically, and yet there's this incredible sort of interest in anti-Semitism and in anti-Jews. They do have their own problem of how they deal with the Koreans. In Korea, it's still Koreans who have lived in Japan generations go out of their way to conceal their Korean background, because if it is found out, they are immediately discriminated against. What the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, all the other stereotypes that emerged in this period of Jews seem to embody is a kind of wish for an explanation of the evils and failures of the modern world. Now, the kind of notion that's along with this sort of simplistic conspiratorial notion is not unknown in this country. If the Protocols have been discredited, one still hears from various elements about, you used to hear about the Council on Foreign Relations. Recently it was the Trilateral Commission, and then ironically enough, it was the Japanese. And even as intelligent, it seems to me, a writer as Jurassic Park, Michael, what's his name? It has promulgated a version of that notion in what he writes very well in some of his writing, particularly in a recent film that promulgated this notion of the Japanese plot to control the world. It's the same version. It's another version, another of the protocol, the Jewish libel. Now, in the 1880s in Germany, anti-Semitic politicians were elected to the Reichstag. But anti-Semitism flourished virtually worldwide in the West. discrimination of all sorts, from exclusion from fraternities in Germany and in the States. The existence, for instance, of fraternities in this country is directly related to that phenomenon. Not to say the existence of black and even in our days Asian fraternities and groups at Stanford. And I want to make this point: this is not just a German phenomenon. God damn it. Okay.
You touch on the Dead Sea Scrolls, what the Jews are left to. I can't count. I'm not aware.
Yeah,
I was learning the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, but I don't really understand your question.
Well, there's a thread of government compiled corpus juris. It was done by Justin of the East.
Yes.
He elevated the Orthodox religion and suppressed the Catholics. What happened in that period of time? But through Roman, the emperor.
Well, that's a whole. So the story of sort of Eastern Jewry is a whole other sort of story. And it's I don't at this point I don't think. Yeah.
The Byzantines, Justinian, kept Jerusalem a city that was open to Jews only under special conditions. That was the Jewish group.
Yeah, I think it's really not at this point irrelevant. Yeah. Anyway, it's worth pointing out that discrimination in general and discrimination against Jews, anti-Semitism as now known, was rampant in after the 1880s, 1890s, all over the Western world, and was a fact of life right up through the 1940s, even in this country. In Germany, back to Germany, in the 1880s, a demented, convicted embezzler school teacher named Hermann Albart advocated the most stringent restrictions on Jews. He declared them foreigners on German soil, exclusion from all cultural and public activities, and eventually confiscation of their wealth and deportation. In the 90s, the German university Burschenschaften excluded Jews. As far as I know, in the United States, I suspect the fraternities which were coming and going at that point also excluded Jews. So nothing unique about this. In the 90s, there was an enormous burst of anti-Zionism that centered around the Dreyfus case. The Conservative Party in 1892, the German Conservative Party, which was a small middle-class party, upper middle class, I guess you would say in Germany, expressed opposition to the widely obtruding and decomposing Jewish influence in our popular life. And in 1893, there were actually 17 elected members of the anti-Semitic party in the Reichstag. And was widespread in a lot of places. The Dreyfus case is the best example of that. It was as strong in France as it was in Germany. The French have a peculiar attitude, or had a peculiar attitude toward Jews. And Alfred Grosser defined it, the great distinguished French historian, described it as, in France, if you're left-wing and Jewish, then you're Jewish. If you're right-wing and Jewish, then you're accepted as a Frenchman. I think Gordon Craig captures the situation best, and I'll finish on this. Every argument that the National Socialist orators used against the Jews in the 20s and, of course, in the 30s had been made before 1914. The only difference was that the Nazis had the strength of their convictions and turned these arguments into a program of action. The concept of the Holocaust was, after all, inherent in a program of the 1880s. All that was needed, says Craig, was Adolf Hitler's demonic will to transform reality. I would add to that, and Europe's catastrophic suicide in the 2 world wars of the century.
Questions? Well, I've got one for Peter then. All right. You suggested there were reasons for the increase of anti-Semitism worldwide in the later 19th century, but would you suggest that? Whoa! I won't.
Gremlins. It's clearly a part of the plot, isn't it? You know,
hold on to it.
Yeah.
To what extent would you suggest that, that industrialization, modernization, democratization, universal suffrage, crisis in general, would you comment on any of these or some of them?
Yeah, I think, the extraordinary, what Craig calls, I left that out, but Craig talks about the price of modernization. He talks about derationalization. And what I think he means is that here you have the majority of the society moving, the society reorganizing itself, moving from a rural into an urban situation, and this is true sort of worldwide. And the extraordinary destabilization that this means meant that two things. First of all, Jews turned out to be singularly well equipped to cope with modern society. Literate. They had some had international connections, but not all. But they were already urban, and so they did well in certain trades where that were now open. But this applies to other groups that were the same way, the literate figures. So I think it's intimately connected to this social upheaval, and then people are looking for ways of blaming themselves. And look at Hitler, who finds himself, by his own cause, a Luftmensch, if that's a complimentary term, on the streets of Vienna, and he can't figure out why anybody doesn't recognize his genius. And suddenly he encounters apparently a non-assimilated Jew, and he thinks, of course, that must be the reason. I had become an Episcopalian. I don't think that probably was a good excuse as any, but I mean, the fact that this reason was given blatantly is an example of the kind of barriers that existed and continue to exist even after the Second World War. The difference, it seems to me, in Germany is that for reasons that had to do with what happened to the Germans before the war and the real who knows?
Well, we could probably say that in neither case was German culture Catholic Christian. It may have been Aryan, that's A-R-I-A-N, Christian. In other words, a heretical, deemed by others in the later date. But on the other hand, it's interesting that some of the German nationalists saw themselves as being on the same side as Jews in their relationship to the Roman Empire. The German patriots saw the Romans coming up and trying to conquer Germany in a similar way as they'd tried to take over Palestine. And the famous, well, in this case, the Romans were clobbered by the so-called Hermann the German, Arminius, who became a very important German folk hero in terms of the war against Western civilization, against the Latin West and so forth, which is all part of this idea of purifying Germany. And so in this case, analogies were made with the Masada and Bar Kokhba and revolts like that the Jews waged against the Romans. But this type of looking for similarities and finding them was very rare in this German search for self and for identity. That's an answer. It may not be what you want.
I mean, the 19th century was just replete with what scholars call the invention of tradition, in which people ransacked the past for their community, for their sense of community, which was being dramatically eroded by modernization. So you had modern notions of being Irish, modern notions of being Welsh, modern notions of being American, that's much more complex phenomenon, and modern notions of being German, essentially created where it couldn't be found, or ransacked, picked, and used specifically. And you have Walter Scott really essentially creating the Scottish, what we think of as being purely Scottish, and most of which there's no documented evidence, for instance, the Scots ever wore a kilt, and the tartans did not exist. They were the creation of the sort of business people probably lowland Scots who wanted to sell more printed wool.
Part of the ransacking was the German, at least a German, a kind of super state, a super Germanic state that had no equals, had never been created, the like of which had never been created up until this time. And so that's in some ways this romantic vision of what the Germans really could do if they had a state that would allow them to be fully free within the state. And that's the kind of state that Bismarck and the Second Reich couldn't really satisfy some of these super patriots in a way, and that's the kind of state that ultimately Adolf Hitler sought, the kind of state that you saw in the movie last week with The Triumph of the Will, a super state with a savior-like leader, and one that would in effect bring Germans into a wholly new type of existence where they could be at one with each other and fulfill all of them themselves individually and collectively, as you saw incidences of in that movie. Anything else out there? Right. Yeah, I'll just put it this way: that a lot of these laws were applied, I wouldn't say equally to Christians and Jews as minorities, but a lot of it depended on the absolutistic ruler of the time. And so there are traditions, truly, but we're talking about never any kind of constitutional limitations or never the rule of law or civil law in Islamic society. There is a Quran, which ought to be respected, or at least admonish the following of respect toward these peoples of the book. But any type of ruler, even one that we in the West see as I mentioned, enlightened, such as Harun al-Rashid, had these inconveniences and more. So a lot of it depended upon the pure whim of the ruler, as I try to point out in China or even Japan, and for that matter Europe too. Maria Theresa, as late as, who's seen as an enlightened monarch by many, expelled the Jews from Prague, some 40,000 of them, from the famous Prague synagogue and cemetery and all that in 1748, and yet within several years after that they were all invited back in, at least those that chose to come back. There was no limitations on her power either. Even Joseph, her son that emancipated the Jews, did that only as an imperial edict, and some other there's absolute monarchy in Austria up until 1849 or so, 1852 to be exact. You could have any ruler do whatever he or she wanted to, and there would be no real way of counteracting it. So you're quite right. There could be really ignominious type of pieces of legislation that even later in the reign could be counteracted by the same ruler. Thanks.
Well, but it's worth pointing out the British monarchy in the last century and more into this century, first of all, is German, but they were also, the British aristocracy were generally anti-Semitic. Now they did include figures, Shields, and the Montagues, and mainly actually Sephardic Jews who had come to Britain and established themselves. But in general, there was a very real thread of anti-Semitism running through the English elite institutions in this period. And in fact, there is a curious thread of outsiderdom allotted to Jews even to this day in England. There was a very interesting article recently in the New Yorker about the Jewish community in
of anti-Semitism in the later 19th century is reinforced by the fact that the two most anti-Semitic Russian Tsars ever were the last two, Alexander III in the 80s and Nicholas II in the 90s and early 1900s. And in fact, in the reaction against anti-Semitism, the communists, the Bolsheviks, made a concerted effort to try to stamp out anti-Semitism. Or you might say Judaism and anti-Semitism, and at the same time, and also whatever capitalist tendencies there were among Jews. But it was good to be tolerant of those of Jewish ethnic background. So this, in some ways, was something that wasn't very successful because, as we all know, beginning in the 1930s, the fear of the other creeping in one or another began to rekindle his mind, and even without Stalin. In fact, if there's any place in Europe that anti-Semitism is on the loose right now, it's in Eastern Europe, and especially in Russia. People are talking about deporting every last one of them, and even if they were all deported, would that be a final solution for Russia? I'm just speaking facetiously, but the point is that I don't think that that there is no, quote, solution other than tolerance, live and let live, and along well together among all different communities on planet Earth.
I don't know. Question?
There were only 10% of the class could be Jewish. There were 55 students. I was one of 5 Jews. That is fact. 1964 is what knocked it in the head, the Civil Rights Act. But as Dr. Mellini pointed out.
As Sanford, I know in 1966, there were no tenured track or tenured Jews in the history department. And that year, Bart Bernstein, Paul Seaver, who's actually a Quaker but is of Jewish extraction, Mark Mangel, and a couple other people came up for being consideration. And in the faculty meeting being chaired by the then very distinguished French historian, Gordon Wright, one of the members of the history department, who doesn't need naming, he's dead, after the consideration of one of these members, turned to the rest of the department and said, well, is he a gentleman? Which was the code word for if he was a gentleman, then he was not a Jew. We know the landmark, Gordon Wright turned to this man and said, I want to hear that kind of a comment again. And that was the end in the history department of the formal policy of excluding Jews. If you remember, there was, before 1966, there were no tenure track Jewish members of the history department, other departments. So it's important to recognize that it didn't end in 1945. Well, yeah.
you.
Set out to show Beatrice there were better ways to raise children.
And every time he does that, you need to tell him, you don't hit. You don't get mad at him, don't hit him back, but don't say, okay.
They were too little to understand, and they didn't even know why they were getting hit, and I hit them.
She needed to be taught ways of discipline instead of being hitting the children or screaming at them or yelling when they did something that she didn't like.
You having fun? Your mom play with you? Well, they taught me how instead of spanking them, just to sit down and talk to them and let them know what it is that they're doing wrong instead of having to hit them all the time. Hold on, okay? Mommy's gonna cook Papa. And it took me a long time to become nice and have patience because I was real bad. I had a bad attitude when I first came here.
It was a long process. It was through the visits that we had. It was through the class with the information that was provided in the classes and through group therapy and individual therapy with her. We had to show her that we believed that she could do it. We had to show her that she was somebody and that she was important.
I really made a change when I opened up and let everybody know what really happened. After that, I started trying harder to get her back, and I succeeded. It was like a dream. I said to myself, now I have everything in this world. I don't want anything else.
Beatrice is so much better now. She has a loving husband. I know now that she's still in the process of healing. And I know that if she ever comes to a crisis, she knows where to find help.
Ryson was old enough to remember what happened, and she's always going to remember what happened to her. And I feel bad because sometimes she gets scared, but I let her know it's not the same anymore. It's going to be different. You got to sit down and really say to yourself, well, I'm going to do this the right way, and I'm not going to hit my kids. I'm not going to hurt them. I'm going to try to get them to understand what's right and what's wrong. That's the difference.
Child abuse affects all of us, and it's going to take all of us to stop it. The people we profiled on this program pay a tragic price for what they know about child abuse. Each of them has a final thought to share.
I think people out there really should take a good hard look at themselves and their own family. I'm not going to say you're going to find something in your family that's inappropriate. I hope you don't. But if you do, I hope you find somebody that can help you.
I would tell other men that you need to learn to communicate with everyone in your family without secrets. Secrets build upon secrets, and you are as bad as your secrets.
I wish that there were people in my life who were informed on this stuff and who really knew the questions to ask. Like, point blank, look me straight in the eyes and ask me if I'm being molested or touched in any way that I feel with.
If you're offending right now, I suggest, if anything, you go get help. Because you can mess up somebody's life, just as maybe somebody done mess up yours.
I wish I had known the reason that I lost my temper with my children was that my expectations were unrealistic, not that their behavior was unacceptable.
Once you open up and you already know, it's gonna make you feel better and you're gonna get help and you're gonna feel a lot more at ease with yourself and love yourself more and love your kids.
Tell anybody who will listen. Tell your parent, tell your neighbors, your friends, tell your guidance counselor at school, tell your teachers until somebody listens to you.
Kids are tell, so they keep it silent. I wish there was a magic word or something that I could say to get kids to tell, to get parents to listen. Every adult in this country needs to listen.
If you are a victim, an abuser, adult survivor of abuse, or if you want help with parenting, consult your local phone book or please call our toll-free hotline number, 1-800-4-A-CHILD. To receive a free pamphlet on how to prevent and stop child abuse, call the same number, 1-800-4-A-CHILD. We can no longer afford to be scared silent. This program was produced by Arnold Shapiro Productions, which is solely responsible for its content, and was made possible by USAA.
To order a videotape of this program, please send a check or money order for $8.50 to Scared Silent, Box 933022, Los Angeles, California, 90093.
This is PBS. As part of public TV's commitment to children and the family, we present a special week of programs focused on education.
As his paper route job, he meets gang members in the neighborhood, and the students have the choice to identify what would be Enrique's next move. Yes.
Are you getting reaction because you chose a boy with a Hispanic name?
Not yet.
Yeah, very positive, since most of our county is Hispanic.
But however, Enrique is, excuse me, is a positive.
It could go both ways. Enough computers that they're finding their ESL kids and their sheltered English kids are real responsive to this. That's the hook to get them into the regular classroom instruction. So, you know, it'll follow them.
The reason I raise the question is because here in Santa Rosa, our gangs aren't really defined along ethnic lines. And there's been a lot of criticism about the way particularly law enforcement has been dealing with potential gang members out in the community, of being racially motivated. And that might cause a problem in a community like this.
Yeah, again, you don't use what's not appropriate in your own community. Yeah.
There's four? Why four in those discounts?
Because that is the whole program. It's a relatively long computer program. Part one,
They're all the same
four. No, same, yeah, same program.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You said those were on Macintosh?
Yes.
Are they protected? Can they be made in for IBM or?
You can copy that.
Any other concerns? The final element are resources. For those of you that are responsible for teaching to the English language arts frameworks, we created an annotated children's literature list, keying them into all of the 5 themes and per grade level. So for instance, for grade 3, we suggest like Two Bad Ants, Chris Van Allsburg's story about 2 ants that go off and have all these adventures, and at the end of the adventures they realize that being connected to their family and going back home was really the safest and the best thing for themselves. So we've chosen pieces of literature out of the state recommended literature. So many of the core readings that you are using in your class can be connected to this framework, the curriculum framework as well. Along with that, UCI had a drug prevention lesson project, and they had many lessons, but we went through all of their lessons, and again we picked out key lessons that fit the themes of the curriculum. And these are available not to replace those, but it's to be a companion. So we recommend several, like Lion's Quest, and here's looking at U2000. We've gone through many of the prevention curriculums and chose the ones that we felt were the very best, and we used our drug and alcohol tobacco educators to help us, and our coordinators at the county office to help us identify those best programs.
How did you do that? Just to cross-reference?
Yes.
The material?
Right.
Lessons?
So again, we took our themes and we said, well, let's see, what themes does here's looking at U2000 addresses, and addresses responsible citizenship and choices and consequences. So again, we wanted to make that connection. Yes,
One
Carol?
way we might use it at 7th grade in our district is we have quest classes, which are 9 weeks, and we're talking about using a week of it and using this curriculum during the week of that quest time.
And that would fit in perfectly. It could just mesh to the themes that you're using in that particular day or that particular week.
Well, see, may I say, another thing is, at junior high and middle school, we often have whatever that curriculum is, like you're talking about. If it's delivered, quote, in a health class or advisement class. And again, our charge was to get this in more than the class. It was to make it infusible enough in English language arts, social science, whatever. Now, whether that's a reality or not, we are having teachers step up to say, I am confronted with issues all the time. I would like to be able to do something, but I don't want to create a curriculum myself. I do not want to throw out what I already have planned for my year, but I would like some lessons that I can infuse as I go along. So our purpose was it could be used as the class, but it was to be infused in other subject areas or to support the teacher school in whatever area it best fit. So.
And for instance, if there is a concern about prejudice, discrimination, racial or ethnic differences, or conflicts, the World of Difference, the B'nai B'rith curriculum is excellent and it addresses those kinds of issues, and again, and matches several of the themes. Extracurricular and non-classroom activity. We can't just tell kids, say no to gangs. We need to give them alternatives, other kinds of activities. So again, we've created listings with names and addresses and phone numbers for you of after-school clubs, again, peer assisted leadership groups, what Nina just spoke to, Just Say No clubs, safety kids, boys clubs, etc., where you as faculty and provide some extra ideas as to those alternative activities that are so important. Media resources, additional videotapes that can be ordered on the themes of drugs and gangs. We provide you all the order information. We annotate it so you can see if it's suitable to your students. And then finally, the electronic bulletin board. In your packet, you have two pieces of material to talk about the electronic bulletin board. The news flash and the description of how to plug in with the computer and modem to the Orange County bulletin board. It is the price of a phone, of your phone connection. Everything else is free. What is on this? Additional curriculum related to gangs and drugs, calendar of prevention events across the state, and also if you want to network and just connect with your that are concerned about the same issues as you are.
Is that ever going to be tied in with Prerequisite, or?
We are in the process of tying that in with a service called Connect. And so all of the information will be in both places, on this bulletin board as well as the system called Connect. Any questions about the elements, the components?
There's one thing I look at, as well as the promotional tape that we showed you earlier, that could give them a flavor of what the project is. And that can be access for your district or whoever you'd like to show it to if they need some more information. Some of the date people have, or the date coordinators in different regions, or the Healthy Kids coordinators have purchased sets that can be looked at for review and preview. You also, if you were pretty serious about purchasing, I think we talked to our marketing person, they could probably send you one for preview. But again, right now we've had quite a rush on all these materials, and they're out in a lot of places. And so we're getting ready to reprint again. Lots of sales in the last couple of months. You had a question?
Yeah, I assume from what you said that that you can use drug-free schools and community SAC monies for this. How about the tobacco prevention education?
Any of the well, Bob, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'm the Healthy Kids
tobacco date person for Lake County.
He's it.
And we received a letter directly from OCJP, which administers the CAPC stuff, and they said that this program has their blessing and they're spending your money on it.
I'm in a secondary district and we don't have any money, but we do have the tobacco use prevention education money. And that's was specifically my question. We can because
yeah, the OCJP funded our project and many of these others, but it's all looked at as prevention monies. And Al Hallenstein said that from the podium to all the date people and the CAPI reps and all of that, because the monies go back into development, and it's not a self-serving situation.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I've heard in some conferences on gang suppression is that there's a real need for activities for kids in the community after school on the weekend. And in your district and in your county, has there been a big press to develop that as a supplement or an add-on to what's going on in schools?
Again, with any change process, it's baby steps, and we would tell you